We are opening up an intensive collection of articles and biographical notes today, focusing on one of the most recognizable and I think intensely studied figures in art history, Vincent van Gogh.
Absolutely.
The material detailing his life, the struggles, the bursts of genius, the tragedy. It's exhaustive, but what we're looking for are the nuggets of understanding that move beyond, the surface story.
It's an essential distinction to make. When we look at the historical record of Vincent van Gogh's life, which spanned 1853 to 1890, we are confronted with this stark and fascinating paradox.
Which is?
Today, his canvases command incomprehensible prices, and they really define modern art. Yet our sources confirm that during his entire lifetime, he only sold one documented painting.
Just one.
Just one, the Red Vineyard. That sale to Anna Bach, who was a fellow artist, occurred very shortly before his death.
That contrast between total obscurity during his working life and his iconic status now, that's the core of our exploration.
Exactly.
We're conducting a structured, thorough analysis of this material. Our mission is to uncover the key turning points in his extraordinarily rapid artistic development, which essentially took place in the last 9 years of his life.
It's incredible acceleration.
And we'll examine his documented periods of intense mental struggle and understand precisely how his enduring artistic legacy was cemented after his death.
And we really aim to move beyond that simple, often sensationalized label of the tortured artist to truly understand the man.
Right.
We want to construct a portrait that is both informed and compassionate, appreciating the meticulous process, the deep intellectual influences, and the profound, urgent communication he attempted to achieve through his art and, of course, through his incredible correspondence with his brother Theo.
Let's start at the very beginning then, laying the groundwork for the incredibly intense man he would become. We can trace the psychological seeds that were planted in his earliest years.
Vincent Willem van Gogh was born in 1853 in Groot-Zundert in the Netherlands. His family was firmly upper middle class, anchored by his father, who was a respected Dutch Reformed church minister.
So a very pious environment.
Pious and with a lot of social expectation, crucially, a kind of rigidity.
And right there, at his birth, we find a curious, deeply poignant detail that scholars have long fixated on as a potential psychological trigger.
The name. He was given the exact name of a brother who had been stillborn precisely 1 year before his birth.
To the day.
To the day. It's a profound structural detail. To constantly occupy the shadow or, the placeholder of a deceased sibling, especially in a Dutch Reformed household where spiritual meaning was applied to everything, it creates an inherent complication in identity.
You can see how that would.
Scholars suggest this contributed to a psychological complex, perhaps fueling a deep-seated need for intense external validation, or, conversely, a sense of having to sacrifice himself completely just to justify his existence.
And we see evidence of this in his own words later on.
We do. He described his youth as feeling austere and cold and sterile. This early unhappiness certainly set the stage for the tumultuous path that followed.
That path began with what seemed initially like a successful career as an art dealer, which makes his eventual artistic direction even more surprising.
Indeed. His first career, working for the international art firm Goupil & Cie, starting around 1869, was a period of material success.
He did quite well, didn't he?
Especially in London. When he was transferred to the London branch, he was only 20 years old and was earning more money than his own father. Theo's wife, Jo, later noted that this might have been the happiest year of Vincent's adult life.
But true to the pattern of his intensity, that happiness was fragile. We see how his consuming emotionality completely derailed this promising career.
The turning point was purely emotional. While lodging in London, he became infatuated with his landlady's daughter, Eugenie Loyer. He proposed marriage, but she rejected him.
And why was that?
She was secretly engaged to another lodger. This rejection absolutely devastated him. The sources indicate he grew isolated, severely depressed, and significantly his religious fervor intensified to an obsessive degree.
So his reaction to emotional failure was to embrace spiritual extremism.
Precisely. And this new, intense spiritual mindset clashed directly with the commerce of art at Goupil & Cie. He became overtly hostile to the idea of art as a commodity.
He resented it.
He railed against the materialism of the market. He believed art was spiritual communication, not merchandise. This behavior made him unsuitable for the role, and he was eventually dismissed in 1876. He had effectively self-sabotaged a successful career based on a matter of intense emotional principle.
So the next pivot was total. moving from commerce straight into the spiritual realm, seeking to become a pastor or missionary.
His commitment was absolute. After failing a theology exam, he eventually secured a post as an evangelist in the working-class coal mining district of Bornage, Belgium, in 1879.
And this is where we see that psychological need for total sacrifice manifest physically.
Yes, the source material details a dramatic, almost fanatical demonstration of commitment. He gave up his comfortable bakery lodgings and moved into a tiny, dilapidated hut, sleeping on straw, giving away his possessions. He was desperate to identify completely with the extreme poverty of his congregation.
This action, which he saw as pure Christ-like devotion, was seen by the institutional church as the opposite of dignified service.
That's the crux of his conflict with institutions. His extreme, humble living conditions alienated him from the church authorities in Brussels. They dismissed him for undermining the dignity of the priesthood.
Because they felt his self-imposed poverty was degrading the institution?
Exactly, the official image of the church. This rejection led to a period of deep isolation and immense concern from his parents. They were so frustrated by his failures in every professional pursuit that his father advised that Vincent should be committed to the lunatic asylum in Geel.
It's a remarkable pattern: intense devotion, followed by a failure rooted in his inability to temper his zeal for institutional expectations. It was only after these dramatic failures that he finally listened to Theo and turned his focus fully toward drawing.
Around 1880, he took up art in earnest. Theo had long encouraged this, and Vincent immediately plunged into technical study, recognizing his lack of formal skills.
He became almost monastic about it.
He did, focusing on anatomy and perspective. He credited his rapid improvement to painstakingly studying Charles Bargues' cours de dessin, or drawing course, which emphasized rigorous copying of plaster casts and master drawings to understand human form. He was desperate to learn how to capture the figure accurately.
Despite this vocational focus, his personal life remained incredibly tumultuous, defined by those raw, intensely emotional failures, particularly with his cousin, Kay Vostricker.
Ah, the tragic romance with Kay. She was recently widowed, and this happened around 1881. Kay was 7 years older, with a young son, and she refused his passionate proposal with that famously absolute phrase in Dutch, "No, nay, never."
And Van Gogh's reaction was desperate and violent toward himself.
When he traveled to Amsterdam, trying to force a meeting, and her parents refused him access, he held his hand directly in the flame of the lamp, shouting, "Let me see her for as long as I can keep my hand in the flame."
That's an incredibly self-destructive act.
His uncle had to forcefully extinguish the flame. This incident is crucial because it demonstrates that the self-destructive emotional state and intensity we associate with the end of his life were fully present in his youth.
These intense emotional episodes seem to be an inseparable part of his creative engine. How did this pattern of self-destruction and defiance manifest in his next relationship, the scandalous domestic arrangement with Sian Horneck?
This was an even greater rift with his family and society. In 1882, he began living with Clasina Maria Sian Horneck in The Hague.
And she was.
Sian was an alcoholic prostitute with a young daughter, and she was pregnant later, giving birth to a boy. This caused a complete break with his family and his artistic mentor, Anton Mauve, who disapproved of him using models from the street, let alone living with Sian.
He initially defended the arrangement, didn't he?
He was entirely defiant. He saw himself as rescuing her and the children, aligning it with his earlier missionary zeal to help society's downtrodden. He believed he was giving her dignity and a stable life.
But the arrangement was doomed.
Completely. They lived in abject poverty, and the conflict between the demands of domestic life and his intense artistic aspirations became unbearable. He eventually left Sian and the children in late 1883, realizing he could not sustain the situation.
And we must pause to reflect on Sian's own fate, which really underscores the profound social desperation of the time.
Absolutely. We have to show sympathy for her situation. The sources remind us that the despair did not end for Sian. The tragedy continued for her after Vincent left, and she eventually drowned herself in the River Scheldt in 1904.
So this early relationship established a complex pattern for Vincent.
It did. Intense, often desperate attachment to social outsiders, total commitment, followed by failure and deepening personal isolation as he retreated back into his art.
Following the breakup with Sian, Van Gogh returns home to the Netherlands, marking the next major phase of development in Nuenen around 1883. This is where the work became serious, but the palette was overwhelmingly somber.
He moved back in with his parents in North Brabant, focusing entirely on painting peasant subjects, weavers, cottages, and still lifes. He dedicated 2 intense years here, completing nearly 200 oils.
And the dominant feature of this period is that almost total lack of color.
His palette consisted almost entirely of somber earth tones, dark browns, muted greens, and heavy blacks, reflecting his internal world and, of course, his subject matter.
And this culminated in his first major work, The Potato Eaters, painted in 1885. This painting is a crucial analytical checkpoint because it shows his resistance to the entire trajectory of modern art at that moment.
That's right. He viewed the Potato Eaters as the culmination of his years spent studying the harsh reality and dignity of peasant character. It was intended to show the laborers as they truly were, reflecting the fact that they dug the food from the same earth that shaped their rough hands and faces.
He wanted the painting to smell of bacon, smoke, and potato steam.
That's what he said.
But if you contrast that with what Theo was seeing in Paris, the bright, airy, modern world of Impressionism, it's easy to see why tension arose between the brothers.
Exactly. This is where the commercial and artistic friction begins. Theo, who was entrenched in the progressive Parisian art scene, saw commercial success driven by light and vibrant color. He complained vehemently that Vincent's paintings were too dark, too muddy, and simply unsellable.
Because they didn't align with the new trends.
They refused to.
Oh.
Vincent, however, was defiantly committed to his vision of social realism. For him, the subject, the dignity of manual labor, was everything, and to paint peasants in the bright colors of the leisure class felt like a betrayal. His resistance was philosophical, not just stylistic.
The sources confirm this period in Nguyen ended turbulently, forcing him out after another incident.
Yes, in September 1885, one of his young peasant sitters became pregnant, and Van Gogh was again accused, wrongly or rightly, of forcing himself upon her. The village priest forbade parishioners from modeling for him.
He was completely ostracized.
Totally. That, coupled with the death of his father earlier that year, drove him to leave Nguyen that November and move to Antwerp.
In Antwerp, he truly hit a physical low point, subsisting in extreme poverty, but paradoxically, this is where the artistic transformation toward color began.
He was renting a room above a paint dealer shop. The financial support sent by Theo was spent almost entirely on art materials and models. He prioritized his vocation over his survival.
Surviving on what, exactly?
Mainly on bread, coffee, and tobacco. He wrote to Theo in February 1886 that he could only recall eating 6 hot meals in the previous 9 months. This disastrous diet and poverty led to significant physical decline, including severe dental problems and potential hospitalization. It was a life lived on the brink.
Despite the dire physical state, he was intellectually engaged, forcing himself to learn new art theories.
Precisely. He used his time in Antwerp to intentionally broaden his artistic education. He studied color theory formally and spent time in museums, heavily influenced by the drama of Peter Paul Rubens and his masterful use of vibrant hues like carmine, cobalt blue, and emerald green.
So the vibrancy that would eventually define him starts to filter in here.
It does, and this is also where his famous fascination with Japanese art begins. We hear the term Japaneserie often in connection with Van Gogh, but what exactly was he taking from those prints?
What was it about them?
Japaneserie refers to the European fascination with Japanese art, particularly ukiyo-e woodcuts, which were flooding the continent in the 1880s. Vincent was buying these prints in the docklands of Antwerp and later Paris.
And what he absorbed were the stylistic elements that revolutionized Western art.
Yes, things like the use of flat planes of pure color, the asymmetrical compositions, the sharp graphic outlines, and the use of high horizons that compress the picture space. He began incorporating these elements into the backgrounds of his own work, effectively flattening some areas and simplifying forms, a massive leap away from the heavy realism of the Potato Eaters.
It's amazing that this academic exploration coincided with yet another dramatic conflict with authority at the Academy of Fine Arts in Antwerp.
This is perhaps one of the most revealing anecdotes about his philosophy. He enrolled briefly in the Academy in early 1886, but immediately clashed with the drawing instructor, Eugene Seibert, who demanded rigid classical study.
And when told to draw the Venus de Milo,
He revolted. The classical ideal statue. In defiance, he drew the limbless, naked torso of a Flemish peasant woman from memory, embodying the gritty reality he was obsessed with.
and he didn't just quietly refuse, he erupted.
He did. He shouted at Seibert, defending his choice of subject. "You clearly do not know what a young woman is like, God damn it. A woman must have hips, buttocks, a pelvis in which she can carry a baby."
So this wasn't just about drawing a figure.
No, it was a rejection of cold, idealized classicism in favor of visceral working-class reality. This confrontation was essentially the last straw before he relocated to the epicenter of modern art. Paris.
In March 1886, he arrived in Paris, moving in with Theo. This must have been a visual shock after the somber environment of the Netherlands and the poverty of Antwerp.
It was an immersion into a radically new visual language. Living with Theo meant there was no need for correspondence, so he lost some of his intimate written insight, but his canvases tell the story of a transformation.
And he was immediately exposed to the avant-garde circle.
Émile Bernard, Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec, and Paul Gauguin. He studied briefly at Fernand Cormon's studio, but that exposure was the real education.
This exposure finally broke him out of his somber palette. He met the Neo-Impressionists.
He was directly exposed to the groundbreaking work of Georges Seurat and Paul Signac, the leaders of Neo-Impressionism. He mastered their technique, which forced him to abandon mixing colors on the palette.
Let's clarify for the listener. What exactly is pointillism, and how did it differ from the spontaneous brushwork of Impressionism?
Pointillism, or divisionism, is a subset of Neo-Impressionism. So, rather than mixing blue and yellow paint on the palette to get green, artists would place tiny pure dots of blue and pure dots of yellow right next to each other on the canvas.
And the viewer's eye does the mixing.
Exactly. The viewer's eye, standing back, then mixes those colors optically, creating a color that is far more vibrant and intense than any pigment you could mix manually. This technical rigor, using complementary colors like blue and orange for maximum vibrancy, was a massive shift for Van Gogh.
You can see his success with this new technique clearly, particularly in his portrait work.
Absolutely. His evolution is undeniable in works like Portrait of Père Tanguy from 1887. The background of that portrait is a riot of color, heavily influenced by the flat planes of Japanese woodcuts. But the colors themselves are often juxtaposed in a divisionist manner.
But after 2 years, Paris had worn him out.
After 2 intense, productive years where he painted over 200 works, he felt completely exhausted. Paris was noisy, overwhelming. The mission became clear. He needed to find the intense, light, and simple life of the South to establish the artistic collective he still dreamed of.
Which brings him to Arles.
In February 1888, Van Gogh moved to Arles in southern France. He was physically depleted from heavy drinking and relentless work, suffering from severe health issues. He sought refuge and rejuvenation, convinced the intense local light would revitalize him.
And the sources confirm that this move ignited his most famous and most prolific phase, the Yellow Period.
It was a creative explosion unparalleled in art history. In just over a year, he completed approximately 200 paintings and over 100 drawings in watercolors.
He was energized by the light.
Overwhelmingly so. The intense light and countryside. He chose his famous palette of rich yellow, ultramarine, and mauve. He believed yellow was transcendent. It symbolized emotional truth, sunlight, life, and the divine. It became his language.
This period wasn't just about productivity. It was fueled by his vision of an artistic collective. That vision centered on the famous Yellow House.
He signed a lease for 4 rooms at 2 Place Lamartine, aiming to create a collective where artists could live, work, and share ideas. A kind of utopian monastery of modern art.
And he decorated it fanatically.
Yes, befriending the local proprietors, the Genoux family. The entire decoration plan for Gauguin's guest room was intended to be, as he described it, a symphony in blue and yellow. This period gave us his iconic series, Bedroom in Arles, Café Terrace at Night, Starry Night over the Rhone, and of course the stunning multiple versions of the sunflowers.
I think we need to analyze why these works are considered revolutionary. He wasn't just capturing light like the Impressionists, he was using color for profound psychological and moral communication.
That's the key analytical insight. He broke entirely from the Impressionist goal of objective light recording. Van Gogh was using color subjectively, expressively. He saw color as having psychological and moral weight.
Like with a night cafe.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He wrote that with a night cafe, he tried to express the idea that the cafe is a place where one can ruin oneself, go mad, or commit a crime, deliberately employing what he called terrible passions through the clashing, garish application of blood reds and electric greens.
So this is the foundation of Expressionism.
Years before the movement had its name, he used colors to express the feeling of a place, not just its appearance.
This intense creative period and the Yellow House itself was all preparation for the arrival of Paul Gauguin, the man he hoped would cement his commune.
Van Gogh prepared with almost obsessive intensity, desperate for Gauguin's validation and companionship. He painted 4 versions of sunflowers in just 1 week, specifically to decorate Gauguin's room.
And Gauguin arrived.
He arrived on October 23, 1888, finally fulfilling Vincent's vision.
They painted together, but the source material suggests this was less a harmonious collective and more a boiling pressure cooker built on a profound clash of personalities.
The initial painting was productive, but the relationship quickly deteriorated. Gauguin was arrogant, domineering, and a staunch advocate of synthesis, painting from memory and imagination, which conflicted with Vincent's dedication to painting directly from nature.
And Vincent wanted to be treated as an equal.
Desperately. But Gauguin often dismissed his work. The tension was constant and quickly spiraled into what Van Gogh himself described as excessive tension. They were arguing constantly about money, women, and art theory.
And this unbearable stress led to the most infamous moment of his life, the mutilation of the ear in December 1888.
On the evening of December 23, 1888, after a severe altercation with Gauguin, who likely fled the Yellow House in fear, Van Gogh suffered an acute mental breakdown, hearing terrifying voices and experiencing delirium.
The historical accounts of the mutilation are conflicting, which adds to the confusion surrounding the event. What exactly are the conflicting accounts regarding the severity of the injury?
Well, Theo's initial accounts and some later claims by the physician Dr. Gachet suggested only the earlobe was removed. However, the police report and the sketches made years later by Dr. Felix Ray, the hospital intern who actually treated the wound, strongly indicate the entire outer ear was severed.
So the common image of just the earlobe is probably an understatement.
It's likely a mitigation designed to reduce the social shock.
The subsequent action shows the sheer level of his confusion and tragedy.
In a state of generalized delirium and severe shock, he bandaged the wound, wrapped the severed part in paper, and delivered the package to Gabrielle Berlatier, a young cleaning girl at a brothel he frequented.
We have to approach this with compassion.
It's essential. We must acknowledge the immense mental anguish and self-harm this act represented. He was found unconscious the next morning by police and immediately transported to the hospital.
And Gauguin, his great hope for the artistic future, abandoned him immediately.
He saw the state Vincent was in and immediately left Arles, never to see Van Gogh again. He gave a statement to the police that the sight of Vincent might prove fatal for himself.
And the hospital's diagnosis?
Acute mania with generalized delirium. He had no recollection of the event. Although he returned briefly to the Yellow House, a petition signed by 30 townspeople, who fearfully nicknamed him Le Fou Rou, the red-headed madman, forced him back into the hospital in March.
So he voluntarily entered the asylum?
Yes. Recognizing his vulnerability and seeking stability, Van Gogh voluntarily chose to enter the asylum at Saint-Remy.
The move to the Saint-Paul-de-Moselle asylum in May 1889 marks the beginning of his final period. It's a profound paradox. A period of immense suffering coexisting with a breathtaking peak in artistic production.
The asylum was a former monastery. Van Gogh was initially given limited freedom, but crucially he was allowed to have 2 cells, one for sleeping and one for use as a studio.
So the environment became his subject.
The asylum gardens, the surrounding countryside, the cypresses and olive trees, they became the intense subjects of his work. This is the period that gifted the world some of his most famous canvases, defined by the iconic swirls and the dense application of paint.
That dense application of paint you mentioned is the technical term impasto. What does Van Gogh's use of impasto tell us about his artistic intent in Saint-Remy?
Impasto is simply the technique of applying paint thickly, so thickly that the texture of the brushstrokes is visible. For Van Gogh, especially here, this wasn't just texture, it was a psychological tool.
How so?
If his colors expressed his feeling, his impasto expressed the energy and movement of that feeling. In works like the Starry Night, the heavy rhythmic lines of the sky and the trees aren't just descriptive, they were Vincent trying to capture the emotional energy and raw movement of the universe itself, vibrating with his own internal chaos.
He became quite obsessed with certain elements of the local landscape, particularly the cypress trees.
He was deeply fascinated. He wrote to Theo, "Cypresses still preoccupy me. I should like to do something with them, like my canvases of sunflowers." He compared their dark, flame-like shape to an Egyptian obelisk, finding a spiritual, vertical energy in them that connected earth to sky.
And the olive trees as well.
Yes, he painted at least 15 canvases of the ancient, gnarled olive trees. It shows him connecting with subjects that embodied eternal struggle and resilience.
His creative process had to adapt to the limitations of asylum life. He couldn't always go outside, which led to an interesting body of work. Interpretations of other masters.
Due to limited outside access and relapses that kept him confined, he began interpreting and copying other artists' paintings, notably those by Jean-François Millet, whose depictions of peasant life he adored, and Gustave Doré.
But he didn't see it as mere imitation.
Not at all. He saw it creatively, comparing his copies to a musician interpreting the work of Beethoven or Bach. taking the structure and filtering it through his own emotional intensity and color palette. It was a coping mechanism as much as an exercise.
We know he suffered a severe relapse between February and April 1890, a time of profound depression.
Even during that relapse, he managed to paint, including the deeply moving color study, Sorrowing Old Man, often known as At Eternity's Gate, which depicts an aging man slumped in despair. This was a powerful, symbolic reflection of his own feelings.
It is genuinely uplifting, given his suffering, that he did experience a brief, significant moment of public validation before his death.
It was crucial. In January 1890, the French critic Albert Aurier published a highly favorable, rapturous review in the prestigious Mercure de France, describing Van Gogh as a genius.
The first major critical praise he ever received.
And subsequently, he was invited to exhibit 10 paintings at the Société des Artistes Indépendants in Paris, and the praise was high. Claude Monet, one of the leading lights of the establishment, publicly stated that Van Gogh's work was the best in the show.
So, while commercially unsuccessful, he achieved critical acclaim among the leading avant-garde artists. That brings us to the final, incredibly productive, yet ultimately tragic chapter. His move to Auvers-sur-Oise.
In May 1890, he left Saint-Rémy and moved closer to Paris, settling in Auvers-sur-Oise under the care of the homeopathic doctor and amateur painter Paul Gachet.
And his first impression of Gachet was revealingly dark.
He wrote to Theo that he thought Gachet was iller than I am, it seemed to me, or let's say just as much. Gachet's portrait, which he painted immediately, emphasizes this melancholic disposition.
Despite his clearly deteriorating mental state, the artistic output was almost unbelievable.
Staggering is the only word. In the final 70 days of his life in Auvers-sur-Oise, he painted approximately 70 oils.
So about one completed major oil painting every single day.
Roughly. He returned to subjects reminiscent of his northern roots, depicting vast fields of wheat under turbulent skies.
He explicitly connected these landscapes to his internal emotional state, didn't he?
He did. He explicitly wrote about those vast fields, linking them to his sadness and extreme loneliness. The work that is most often associated with his final, doom-filled psychological state, even if it wasn't his very last canvas, is Wheatfield, with Crows from July 1890.
Its dark palette, heavy brushstrokes.
And the ill-omened flock of black crows. It conveys a profound sense of menace and despair. It is a terrifying visual testament to his final internal struggle.
That intense, volatile period came to an abrupt, self-inflicted end on July 27, 1890.
On that Sunday, age 37, Van Gogh shot himself in the chest with a revolver, likely in a wheat field or a local barn. The bullet was deflected by a rib and lodged near his spine, causing infection, but he did not die instantly.
He managed to walk back.
He walked a mile back to the Auberge Revue, where he was attended by Dr. Gachet.
Theo rushed to his side, ensuring he was not alone at the end.
Theo arrived the following morning, finding Vincent initially in decent spirits. But his condition rapidly failed due to the infection. Vincent died in the early hours of July 29 with Theo by his side.
And his last words?
His reported last words, which Theo recorded, were profoundly sad and emblematic of his entire intense suffering life. The sadness will last forever.
And the tragedy of this profound human connection doubled just 6 months later.
Theo, who had been Vincent's emotional anchor and financial lifeline for a decade, never recovered. Already suffering from syphilis, his health declined rapidly. He died only 6 months later in January 1891.
It's a stunning, heartbreaking end to their dual journey.
It is. And in a final beautiful gesture, Theo's widow, Jo van Gogh, had Theo's body exhumed and moved in 1914 so that the two inseparable brothers could finally be laid to rest side by side at Auvers-sur-Oise.
It is clear that the man who sold only one painting in his lifetime only achieved global, staggering fame because of the tireless dedication and structural brilliance of one person, Theo's widow, Johanna van Gogh.
Jo van Gogh is, without hyperbole, the architect of Vincent's fame. She was a Dutch woman left with an infant son and literally hundreds of paintings that, at the time of Theo's death, were looked upon as having no value at all.
She faced a massive challenge.
A massive logistical and financial challenge in preserving this legacy, which included around 600 letters and 400 canvases and drawings.
What were the key elements of her strategy that transformed a collection of worthless paintings into an artistic phenomenon?
Her strategy was brilliant and two-pronged. First, she tirelessly championed his work, arranging exhibitions, not just in the Netherlands, but traveling across Germany and France, ensuring the work was seen by prominent critics, collectors, and crucially, emerging artists,
She was relentless.
in promoting his posthumous career through sheer visibility.
But the second part of her strategy, publishing the letters, was arguably the most powerful tool in shaping the narrative.
Absolutely. Jo understood that the art needed a story, a human framework. She painstakingly edited and published his intimate, eloquent correspondence with Theo in 1914. These letters didn't just discuss paint colors and money.
No, they exposed his philosophical depth, his passion, his suffering.
And his profound intellect. This established his reputation not merely as a talented painter, but as the archetype of the misunderstood, sensitive genius who sacrificed everything for his art.
That narrative structure, the genius who suffered and died young only to be discovered later, resonated deeply across cultures.
It absolutely created what the sources call the romantic ideal of the tortured artist. That narrative was amplified later in the 20th century by popular works, most notably Irving Stone's highly successful 1934 biographical novel, Lust for Life.
Which was directly based on the published letters.
And the novel and subsequent film adaptation cemented his fame, particularly in the United States, where, as Doe noted, only a few hundred people had heard of Van Gogh before the book became a bestseller. The story became as important as the art itself.
Now let's move from the myth to the art's direct impact on modern painting. His bold techniques profoundly changed the course of art history in the early 20th century.
His influence was seismic. Van Gogh's techniques, his bold, non-naturalistic use of color, his expressive rhythmic line, and the thick, built-up texture of his impasto provided a new language for artists who felt constrained by the objective focus of Impressionism.
Which specific movements took his visual language and ran with it?
The primary inheritors were the Fauves and the German Expressionists. The Fauves, led by Henri Matisse and André Derain, were entirely focused on liberating color from its descriptive function.
They saw Van Gogh's example.
They saw him using color purely for emotional impact and built their movement around it. We know Matisse, then an unknown student, was introduced to Van Gogh's work in 1896. Influenced by this, Matisse immediately abandoned his somber academic palette for the pure, bright colors that would define Fauvism.
And the German Expressionists, what did they take from him that was different from the Fauves?
The Expressionists, such as members of Die Brücke, were looking for a way to use art to reflect internal psychological anguish and social critique. They were drawn less to Van Gogh's joyful yellows and more to his rhythmic, agitated lines and the thick texture of his paint, the impasto, which spoke of raw energy and suffering.
So his ability to distort reality, to express feeling, became their foundational principle.
It offered a path away from academic rigidity toward subjective emotional truth.
Commercially, the shift from selling one painting to becoming one of the most valued artists globally is a stunning economic narrative.
It's an economic anomaly. The commercial value of his art is almost incomprehensible when contrasted with his lifetime poverty. His works are now among the world's most expensive ever sold.
You're talking hundreds of millions.
In today's equivalent dollars, yes, for works like Portrait of Dr. Gachet and Irises. Just as an example, in 2015, L'Allée des Éléphants sold for $66.3 million at auction. The investment in his art is global and intense.
Beyond the canvas and the auction houses, his art has profoundly permeated popular culture, showing how his image transcends the art world.
His cultural footprint is immense. The popular folk song Vincent, composed by Don McLean in 1971, which opens with the lyric Starry, Starry Night, introduced his story to a global audience.
And of course, the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam.
Opened in 1973, it holds the world's largest collection of his work and is a true global landmark, with the vast majority of its millions of yearly visitors coming from abroad.
We should also acknowledge a darker but historically significant facet of his legacy concerning the history of art ownership and conflict.
It's a painful but necessary part of the discussion. A significant aspect of his legacy involves the issue of Nazi-looted art.
His works were highly sought after,
both by private collectors and for removal from collections deemed degenerate. A large number of artworks were taken, many from Jewish collectors forced into exile or murdered. Even today, decades later, the German Lost Art Foundation still lists dozens of missing Van Gogh works.
It underscores the complexities and injustices that continue to this day.
It does.
And his fame remains so potent that it continues to make headlines in the modern era, being used as a backdrop for activism.
We saw an example of his enduring iconic status very recently in October 2022, when climate activists protesting the fossil fuel industry chose one of his works as a target. They threw tomato soup on his sunflowers in the National Gallery, London.
Fortunately, the painting was protected by glass and unharmed.
It was, but the choice of target highlights how immediately recognizable and culturally charged his works remain as symbols of global cultural heritage.
And finally, a lovely note that connects his global status back to his humble origins.
In October 2024, the area in North Brabant where Vincent van Gogh grew up, the landscapes that shaped his earliest years and inspired his first somber works, was officially granted national park status, titled the Van Gogh National Park.
A fitting recognition.
A beautiful recognition that links the icon back to the very earth he painted.
So, we have traced his arc from a meticulous, struggling artist focused on realism and drawing, through failure, to his conversion to color and expression, achieving his iconic stylistic peak.
All within a span of just 9 years, between 1881 and 1890.
It is truly one of the most remarkable creative accelerations in history. The final thought we are left with is this. He used color and abstraction to express overwhelming emotion, leading to the works that define him. Yet, near the very end of his life, specifically concerning his abstraction in works like The Starry Night, he worried that he had gone too far, writing that reality had receded too far in the background.
He was self-critical to the end.
Consider what it means for us today, that this momentary self-criticism, this feeling of having momentarily missed reality in his pursuit of pure expression, has resulted in some of the most enduring, influential paintings in the history of art.